Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker, where today we'll be continuing our Physician Enterprise Performance Improvement podcast series. Last time we talked about revenue cycle management, and today we will be beginning our discussion around provider compensation design and how that relates to physician enterprise performance. And we're happy that you could join us and hope that we're able to share some valuable information here today. This is Brant Jewell, Senior Vice President at Coker, and I'm joined today by Alex Kirkland, Vice President who leads many of our compensation related initiatives for Coker, as well as Andy Sobczak, Senior Manager, and Baines Welch, a Senior Associate. Today we're going to be discussing a number of ways that we view the world as it relates to provider compensation and how we engage with clients to improve their compensation strategy and design, as well as integrate that into their strategic objectives and the overall performance of their physician enterprise. And one of the key things that we like to focus on out of the gate is making sure that compensation plans are aligned with organizational goals and that it's used as an incentive strategy for your provider network. And when we think about the context of today's discussion, we're going to mostly discuss it within an employed or hospital employed provider model, but the same approaches and tenets can apply to other types of organizations as well. These are the most common for the multi-specialty medical groups, and so we're going to focus our efforts there here today for discussion purposes. There are always a few dynamics to consider when clients approach us with compensation concerns. Sometimes that's directly related to fair market value and how much we're spending on compensation. Are we paying the right amount? Other times it's, are we incentivizing our providers to pursue the right outcomes, or whether that's volume related or quality related, growth related. Are we incentivizing the behavior that we want with our comp plan? And then do we have a comp plan that allows us to effectively recruit the kind of talent we know we need for our community and our health system? I think also how you administer the comp plan is something that is often overlooked, and just the confusion, if you've grown as many groups have in health system environments by acquiring practices and special deal after special deal, sometimes we step into environments where it's not that the comp plan is bad on its face or it doesn't work, it's that we have 15 different ones and we're trying to administer them with different incentive structures, different payment models, and all sorts of things that make it complicated and inefficient to have a consistent comp plan. And so you might find yourself in a situation where you don't really need to reduce your spend. The incentive structure is well aligned with your strategic goals, but simply the way that you administer it requires an overhaul to make it more efficient and a more sustainable platform for growth. So we're going to talk about all those aspects here today and how that ties into provider productivity. And so rather than diving into how we work with providers to get more productive on an individual or group basis today, we're going to start here from an incentive perspective. And then in our next session, we'll cover more how we use the compensation plan to incentivize that right behavior. And then once the incentives are in place, how do we foster growth and foster better efficiency within those practices to increase production, better achieve organizational objectives, increase revenue. And then we'll also get into what happens when the compensation design isn't enough and there are other things that you have to do to improve production. So to begin with here today, I'd like to see if, Alex, you'd be willing to go ahead and just kind of share some of our philosophies around comp plan strategy and design, and just talk about some of the work you do and what we like to look at and think about when we're working with organizations in this way.
Thanks so much, Brant. It's great to be with you today. Right now, we are suffering from rising inflation and increased labor costs and a whole litany of increased cost on the physician side of the ledger, while physician revenue is stagnant. And so what we're seeing is growing losses. And I think what that does is it puts a lot of pressure on medical group executives, those people that are responsible for the physician enterprise bottom line. Why are my losses growing? Those types of things. And I think what we need to recognize is that while the physician side, the Part B revenue, is smaller than the Part A revenue, if you can't mobilize the physician workforce in a meaningful way, they're the tip of the spear. They're driving everything else. And by no means am I wanting to set up a structure that is going to illegally compensate a physician. But what I am suggesting is to understand the dynamics in play within your own environment. What are the reimbursement factors that need to be aware of? How are the physicians, what is the strategy of employing them? Meaning, what is your primary care to specialist ratio? How are you staffing your hospital beds? What are you doing with hospital medicine? Is that something that's being outsourced or employed? All of those types of considerations are foundational to understand how you're going to go about setting a physician compensation philosophy. When I think about setting that philosophy, and once those variables that are referenced are understood, there are three major areas that can affect a physician's behavior to help drive towards the collective goals of the organization. And number one is to align the incentives of the physicians with the reimbursement structure or the organizational strategic objectives. And so bottom line, you want whatever the physician is doing to do more of, so it results in more bottom line revenue for the organization and subsequently for that individual physician. So that's first thing, is to understand what the reimbursement structure looks like. Make sure that you're incentivizing, that you're putting the right carrots and sticks in place to drive those types of behaviors. And once you have those incentives in place, then you have to support the physicians with the second leg of that stool, I'll call it, by setting them up with supplying them with the right frontline resources. If you are overly incentivizing on production, but they don't have any staff in order to drive that productivity, then the compensation model may not be as effective as was desired. And so, Brant, you're focused on the physician enterprise performance improvement. I think it goes beyond just physician compensation into, are you appropriately staffing the clinics? How are you more efficiently moving patients into different rooms? What are you doing to follow up with those patients to make sure that you're getting the right patients in to see the physicians? Making sure that the physicians, they have the resources needed in order to do what they went to school to do, which was to heal patients and provide medical care. And then I think the number three area that would help support to drive physician behavior change is to apply the right governance structure, making sure that they have a voice at the table, being transparent with information through peer pressure of benchmarking results. And physicians, they're a competitive breed, and they are entrepreneurials at heart, meaning that they are managing their own practices. And so there's a competitive spirit that they have among themselves, wanting to perform well within their peer network, as well as broader performance benchmark standards. So I think those are three legs of the stool to put in place to make sure that you are driving a compensation plan effectively, understanding those three dynamics of aligning the incentives, supplying the frontline resources, and then applying a governance structure that will monitor this on a go-forward basis.
Alex, could you tell us, when you are first engaged in your meeting with groups to figure out and assess those different legs of the stool as you describe them, where you think there's typically the most opportunity, or maybe what order you typically approach those in, or see groups approach those in?
Well, focusing on compensation, it's all about aligning the incentives, and then it's working tangentially with operations to make sure that the resources and the infrastructure is there so that the physicians can maximize that compensation plan. But that's where our focus is on aligning the incentives. And that starts with understanding the reimbursement structure. If you're in a heavy fee-for-service environment, work RVUs are a great production metric that incentivize fee-for-service. If you are crossing a link into value, meaning maybe you're in the MIPS program, and so a portion of your fee-for-service revenue is subject to quality metrics, Perhaps there's the rate per work RVU that you're paying the physicians. There could be a carve-out amount. How much goes towards value-based activities or quality-based metrics, those types of things. And then to the extent that you're in a fully capitated environment or heavily in the value-based realm, you may be looking at more cost of care outcome type metrics that you're rewarding, or rewarding the physicians on the primary care side for market share and for panel management, those types of things. So we focus on the alignment side of that three-legged stool, and then once we're honed in on all right, how do we align the incentives with the mission, vision, and values of the organization? Then we are looking to understand what is that reimbursement structure and what compensation model is best going to support that compensation structure. It's a difficult task that a lot of organizations, they need outside support from, because it's not as easy as designing a math formula. And so sometimes organizations will fall into the trap of, I've got the perfect formula. Here it is. This is the be all end all compensation formula. And what may be neglected in that instance is that if that's something that is designed without physician input, it may not carry water once it's presented to the physicians. And so, as I mentioned earlier, physicians, they're entrepreneurs, and they want to make sure that they have a seat at the table. Instead of being told something that they need to do, it's far more likely that it would be successful if the physicians contribute to the development of that compensation model. We like to partner with organizations, bringing our outside third-party perspective. This is what we've seen be successful, working with a subset of physician leaders and administrative leaders throughout the process, and providing some education on, here is your reimbursement structure that you're in. These are some of the models and production metrics that we see successful organization in these same reimbursement structures implement. And then it's walking through in a logical manner, how do we want to effectuate those different compensation components? Meaning, do we want to put in place a multi-tiered work RVU model, or is that overly complex? And so having the physicians have a seat at the table, contributing to the development of those components can be very well received. And that oftentimes that's the needed ingredient so that a comp model design doesn't just sit on the shelf. There's change management, and that people are going to come from diverse backgrounds with diverse perspectives. And so it is trying to support those multiple perspectives and moving the process forward through objective data points and going back to what is aligning the physician incentives, the mission, vision, and values of the organization.
Is it safe to say that many of the tenets you look to implement in comp plans with clients around the country are consistent in terms of the outcome that you're pursuing, and yet kind of the art of how you design it specifically with that organization is highly variable? And maybe said more simply, there's not an ideal comp plan that we have that we go around installing with different groups. It's truly, even if we're after a similar type of incentive structure, there are always unique elements for the organization based on where they are, where they're starting from, the specialties that they're working with, et cetera.
Yeah, there's usually common perspectives, but then there's permutations on those perspectives. And it doesn't mean that there's a right or wrong answer for anybody. And oftentimes we'll want to facilitate some of those conversations so that we don't allow a client to make a decision that would result in an unintended consequence, but try to facilitate the conversation that leads to logical decision making. This makes sense. These are viable alternatives. How do we want to make a decision around one of these areas that allows for the long-term sustainability of this compensation model? And we'll talk through pros and cons. Sometimes there's not a right or wrong answer. Sometimes there is a right or wrong answer. And it just kind of depends on what that given element is. And that's where we step in with our expertise to try to facilitate that conversation, but also to prevent unintended consequences from taking place. we want to make sure that anything that we do is going to result in a fair market value compliant model as well. And so we're very much in tune with how the economics are set within the model. Although our conversations are centered around structure first, let's talk about philosophically what is or is not going to be motivating from a physician perspective. Get the structure set first, then we can apply economics to that structure. And what that does is it results in a pretty sound model that can stand the test of time. If you go it then reverse and you're setting economics first, what will happen inevitably is that model will work as it gets launched, but in a year or two or more, it will fail because it is seeking to achieve an end result as opposed to looking at things objectively. This is what we want to set up. This is what we want to reward. In an ongoing basis, it will account for that.
That's helpful. So, Alex, maybe tell us, as we are initially asked about opportunity related to compensation and productivity, we're often assessing groups and trying to identify whether their comp plan and comp strategy is aligned and is, whether they're spending too much, whether they're getting what they should out of it, whether they have risks that they haven't seen. Maybe talk about how you approach that and what the analysis looks like.
Yeah, and there's two core pieces of analysis, broadly speaking, and I've been talking about the second portion of that, which is the qualitative piece, having interviews with physician leaders, speaking with other administrators and stakeholders in the organization, and trying to understand what would be motivating and garnering insight into why we're seeing things the way that we are. That qualitative analysis is one piece of it. It's often led by quantitative analysis, where we're requesting data, analyzing production compensation benchmarks, inclusive of financial metrics. And Baines, I know that's something that you're often involved with on the physician enterprise performance improvement work. Why don't you talk about the quantitative analysis that we go through?
Sure. The first step in diagnosing issues related to compensation and production or before changing compensation model is to conduct a landscape review. This helps provide perspective around current state and where opportunities worth addressing are. So typically we'd start with, common analyses such as key performance indicators for compensation and production, like total cash compensation, worker reuse, collections, various ratios of those, and benchmarking those against industry data to understand where this practice organization stacks up compared to the rest of the country. Furthermore, we might look at things like compensation and production scatter plots to make sure that compensation and productivity is commensurate with each other. And finally, we may look at trying to quantify the financial opportunities by looking at a gap to median analysis. What happens if we bring providers producing at the 25th percentile up to median, for example? What's the financial impact for the organization for achieving those potential volume targets? Importantly, benchmarks and analyses like this are an excellent place to start, but lack the nuance or specific organizational detail to stand on their own. Like Alex said, qualitative interviews with physicians, practice managers, or executive leaders allows you to better understand the organizational goals and provider perspective so you can put a compensation plan in place that works for everyone. For example, you may just see a physician that has higher TCC compared to work over you, but as digging into it further and speaking with the physician and practice leaders, you understand it's driven by them practicing at a new location because the organization has made a strategic decision to grow their geographical presence. They don't yet have the patient volume to support a physician there full time, but believe that having a physician there is an important aspect in order to achieve that. You also may find that looking at the metrics at the group level helps explain deviations. So, for example, one physician has much higher collections than another in the group because the practice has decided that this physician is the most efficient in the procedure operating room. They want to funnel patients toward him. He focuses on the procedure, and other physicians focus on the E&M visits. So those type of disparities that are not immediately apparent within the data can be explained by taking that extra step to meet with people and understand the group dynamics. Andy, are there any other considerations that organizations should make with regard to the landscape review or as they're going about an actual implementation?
Yes. Thank you, Baines. There are a lot of other considerations that go into these reviews before we can get to a point where we are confident in making a recommendation towards new structures or approaches to compensation. Some of those considerations include local market dynamics. We'll often try to get as much information as we can about competitors in the area, whether that's through the physician interviews or information that may be publicly available that leadership may have for us to compare to what an organization is trying to accomplish within a particular model. Additionally, it's not always just about taking a specialty or a practice and benchmarking that entire group to one measure. We'll often break it out if an organization, has multiple different comp models in place. Take a model that's just base compensation with no incentive, or a model that is very low base compensation but heavy on incentives. We'll break those two groups out and benchmark them separately. We had a client very recently where the general feeling from the physicians was, we are very undercompensated compared to the market. If you looked at that group as a total, they didn't look too bad in terms of where they benchmarked versus where they were producing. But if you broke them out into the physicians that were new and were on their guarantees versus those that were established and were mostly on incentives, there's a huge discrepancy between those two. The ones on the guarantees looked like they were pretty well paid ahead of where they were producing, whereas the ones that were on the incentive model were actually flipped and the other way around. So it kind of balanced out, but you had those docs that were more well established. They were the ones that were a little more disgruntled about the comp plan, and they were looking around their competitors and seeing higher rates and other incentives. So the organization itself was very competitive on the front end in terms of what they were offering, but on the back end, in terms of keeping physicians and keeping them motivated and incentivized, they had some work to do. And so going a little deeper in that way is very helpful. Additionally, we find that, in terms of implementation and how we're making decisions on models and rolling things out, it's very important to identify the right people to be involved. Alex kind of hinted at this at the beginning, involving physician stakeholders. If it's an APP model, looking at PAs and NPs as well, involving leadership there, making sure the right folks are making the decisions and it's not necessarily just done in a vacuum, then pushed to the physicians or the providers, but there's some level of collaboration and frequent communication about what's going on. And then speaking of communication, once we do come to a consensus with the client and those we're working with on what model is going to work best or what steps are going to work best for them and achieve their goals, educating the providers, those that were not directly involved, maybe those that weren't interviewed, those that really only knew that there was a project going on but didn't know, the details of it, having educational sessions with them before the real implementation begins. There are a lot of things that go into a decision to redesign a model or have a model looked at. And so educating the physicians on the why there, oftentimes it may take more than one session. We have a lot of clients that, are coming in now and trying to change work RVU rates to align with the fee schedule changes that were made in 2021. Very drastic changes to the work RVU values. And so a lot of them held on the old values until they understood the impact on their compensation models. So maybe not every physician understands that. Why are we changing now? And so, industry trends and industry perspectives are very important to share with the provider group as it relates to the context behind why their compensation plan may be changing and what it's all about. If we're introducing a quality measure that they maybe didn't have before, why are we doing that? This isn't necessarily something I've had to worry about in the past, so why does that matter to me? So we'll often have one session about the why and then another session or two about the actual model itself. What's changing? What does it mean? And then on top of that, we'll layer in individual modeling for the doctors or the APPs on how it's going to impact them. And so everybody would understand before anything even goes live, what to expect, what they're going to be incentivized on, what it might mean for them in terms of their take-home pay. All of those things would go into what we would call, a fully effective and efficient process. And so there are a lot of decisions to be made along the way to get to that point. And I think the key takeaway there is involving the right people, making sure you're transparent in communication with the physicians, but then also explaining the why and understanding the dynamics behind the change, the decision to do a new compensation model. Other things that we get into in terms of changing models may not just be involved, may not just involve work review rates or things that are more bread and butter, but we may have other components that we add into the model or that a client, may be interested in. And that's where I think Alex and Brand, you may have some unique perspectives there in terms of other compensation model components that we may consider and how we go about those, and maybe some of the industry perspectives there as well.
Before getting into those other components, I did want to circle back on APPs. I know that you were mentioning that a couple times. And what we see is a mixed bag where some organizations will still have APPs roll up under human resources, total rewards control for how they set compensation. And that's really tends to put them on a nursing model. There's a base salary and a merit increase that's considered, and that's it. When you look at the landscape ahead with the Bureau of Labor Statistic projections, APP roles for PAs and NPs is growing at a very fast pace. I think 40% by 2034, 2030, something like that. And so because we're going to have so many more patients in the country needing healthcare services, advanced practice providers are going to make up a more meaningful composition of the overall provider mix. For that reason, it makes sense to get them under the medical group control. And when I say control, what I mean are the compensation models, the governance processes, those types of things that really recognize their compensation from a provider lens as opposed to a nursing lens. So that was one thing I wanted to comment. Some of those other components for quality metrics, there's a number of organizations that want to incorporate quality within their model. And I think it's a good idea to get a quality structure stood up. Even if there's no or minimal quality payments that are coming in, it's always so much easier to start to reward quality once you have a structure than to have to get a structure put together and then figure out how to pay the quality. And so we work with organizations first on the compensation structure that incorporates a quality or non-productive component of compensation, and then we'll provide thoughts on a framework of how they can go about selecting those metrics. Bottom line is we can provide some guidance on that and want to provide that guidance into the right governing body, but do not want to tell a physician this is the metric that they will be beholden to. And instead, could we educate and provide some insights to a quality committee or some other body that helps them make informed decisions on this is the data that we can measure, this is the information that we have and the confidence that we have in that data. This is a phased plan on how do we get more and more meaningful outcomes related to some of these metrics that we can target now and a future state as well.
Alex, how effective do you think the good citizen type incentives are in comp plans, where not only do we want physicians to be incentivized around quality or productivity, but we want them to attend meetings, we want them to close charts on time, want them to name that thing that is another layer. And if you think they are effective, is there an amount of a percentage of the compensation or amount that you think is kind of a threshold to actually change behavior? Just curious as to your experience in seeing those types of provisions in a contract.
It varies, but generally speaking, my perspective is that those citizenship type expectations, those are expectations, not an incentive component that you want to pay around. And so I think that goes back to the culture of the group. Are there clear minimum standards to be employed by that organization? Are those understood? And that's where I would kind of base those citizenship areas. Now, for organizations that are launching quality-based beginnings and they don't have metrics, sometimes what we will see is meeting attendance and some of those citizenship metrics used as a bridge just to get to the next year when they can target patient satisfaction, or not even that, but a process-based metric of closing charts on time or something of that nature. But I would view that no more than a bridge strategy to launch the program. And more often than not, I would tend to lump that into minimum expectations of employment.
do you have any thoughts on bringing practices or acquiring practices and putting them into a model that is what we consider to be more traditional health system models around work RVU production, when maybe that group has only been incentivized around collections before and don't really understand their ability to impact certain areas? Or I know that's part of the acquisition process, is to educate, but are there any kind of tips or tricks that you've come across that help with that process and kind of integrating physicians into a common comp model? Maybe it's not always acquisitions. Maybe it's just integrating disparate comp models into one as you try to make an integrated group happen. But any thoughts there?
Well, as far as the compensation model spectrum, it's a wide, end to end. There's a lot of different variations of this. On one side is private practice, where collections drive the compensation model. You can only pay out what you have after you've paid for expenses. And so any work RVUs in that environment, if they were utilized as an allocation methodology only. That's very different on the other end of the spectrum from a hospital employed mechanism, where work RVUs are the sole funding source, and people or providers are paid on a rate per work RVU. And so understanding where the organization, the groups coming together are historically from that perspective, that's important so that you can help provide that right information. But then what I would say is that too often organizations have made a special deal here or an acquisition there, and all of a sudden what they look back and see is, yes, we built critical mass, but everyone has different incentives. One, that may not be fair and equitable, right? Some people may be getting a better funding mechanism than others. And so I think that what is desired is philosophically, how do we view compensation? What is fair and equitable as far as how we're going to fund this compensation plan? What are the components that we want to use to incentivize physicians accordingly, and moving towards a standardized compensation model that's fair and equitable? And when I say standardized compensation model, I don't mean that an urgent care doctor may be paid the same way as a cardiologist. I mean that the philosophy that drives the model is going to be consistent. And there may be consideration for some different, for hospital-based care that is more needed on, hey, they're needed, to provide coverage, volume agnostic. Well, that's probably going to be a time-based model that would be put in place there, as opposed to a primary care model. Maybe there's a panel element that incentivizes new patient capture, something of that regard. But still, there's going to be a common philosophy that can tie them all together. And that common philosophy can also be rooted in, how do you fund the model? What are the economics of the model? Those types of things. So there's a lot that goes into it. Those are just some thoughts to answer your question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, and just the last few minutes here, I think maybe we'll transition to the implementation of comp models, and then some of the things that we try to avoid, common mistakes or pitfalls, how we monitor the success of a comp model, and just kind of go around the horn here to get thoughts on what we do once you found the right model, and how you go through from there. So Andy, why don't you start? Just maybe talk about how the incentives are measured and monitored, and kind of the post-implementation management.
Yeah, very critical aspect here. And I think most of the time we would suggest to keep it as simple as you can. We want it to be effective. We want it to be incentivizing doctors or providers in the right way, but it also needs to be replicated, right? It needs to be administered in a way that isn't going to create confusion amongst the provider group. And so, as Alex mentioned previously, determining the work RVU incentive, do you just want one tier or multiple tiers? Do you have the systems in place to even build a report around that? Do you have people in place to calculate those incentives? And then how frequently are you going to share it with the providers? Because that is something we see very often, providers that, may be under a certain model, but they don't understand the calculations, or they've written it off completely because they don't get the reports that they need in a timely manner, or they get the reports and they're wrong. And so, I think we would stress simplicity there. function in terms of what you're deciding and how you're administering. And it needs to be functional, and it needs to be easily understood by the doctors. On the quality side, that can be a little bit of the Wild West in terms of what we see clients doing. There are some where departments and physician groups will decide their own measures, and they will be calculated and measured in one area, and then they'll be sent to the payroll people in another, and they're just stroking a check. And so it's like, who's auditing those measures? Are those measures meaningful? What's the process to determine that they're meaningful? And so that kind of gets back to Alex's point on the governance structure. Would say that that's a very key takeaway, to have that appropriate and effective governance structure in place to have the physician representation on the topics of quality, who's determining the measures, but then also how they're being calculated, how frequently they're being calculated, is the data valid? All of those things need to be managed in a very organized way to ensure that the model, as Alex mentioned previously, again, withstands the test of time. And so I think those are all key aspects that we try to emphasize as it relates to measurement and monitoring and those things.
A very important consideration that we have not touched on is base compensation. And so how is base compensation set? And base can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. It could mean that it's a guaranteed minimum amount. It could mean that it is a draw amount, simply to provide the physician with a regular stream of income in between measurement of their incentive pay. How do you structure the incentives? Is it stacked on top of base, or do you view base as a reconciling item where the comp model is the model and you're truing up against what's been paid to the physician, or you have some type of floor parameters in place? That's just another area that I can see some organizations falling into some traps of, is how does base compensation play into the model, such that if it's set too high from a guarantee perspective, you may not be able to generate the results that you want to see. Physicians may have the perspective of living off that guarantee. If it's set too low, it may not provide the right amount of security that provider workforce is looking for. And so there's a perspectives that we tend to have when we're thinking about base compensation, and talk about that throughout the process, both with the working group that's comprised of physicians and administrators, and other stakeholders throughout the process.
Alex, you want to keep going since you have the mic, on just things that we see that are common mistakes or areas to avoid, just be careful with. I think we may have touched on a few of them here as we've gone, but maybe just summarize those for us if you could.
Well, I'll talk about the elephant in the room around survey data and how that's just crazy right now. Now more than ever is I would caution against having an over-reliance on survey data. It is needed to assess fair market value. It is insightful and provides good guardrails to set some economic parameters. But different organizations are reporting different work RVUs based on how they have implemented the Medicare physician fee schedule changes of those outpatient RVUs for E&M codes. And so not everyone's reporting the same way on those work RVUs. And so trying to get overly bought in with this is the percentile that the survey says, that can also help or not help, that can harm some groups as well, trying to keep up with that survey data. We see organizations, more so right now, when the surveys are in such flux, maybe targeting, this is the amount of compensation that we're going to fund on a rate per work RVU basis for this year, add a certain amount for the next year, maybe look at a 3-year amount where they have the ability of adding to that rate per work RVU as recruitment and retention needs dictate, but not committing themselves to adding to that. That could get them into some compliance concerns too, depending on what, pre-planned increases to the rate, what that does in relation to how the market moves and what fair market value is, those types of things. So the surveys are a big area that I would just caution groups on how you're interpreting and applying those insights. That's a big area to think about with a grain of salt.
Thanks. Baines, anything with relation to monitoring and reporting once we have installed a new comp plan that's important to remember?
Absolutely. As Andy said, a common theme of successfully managed compensation plans is they do an excellent job of monitoring progress by reporting and providing accurate, transparent, and easily digestible reports and dashboards to providers. You never want to be in a situation where providers are surprised at the end of the year by their compensation calculation, or you don't want to be surprised yourself when the physician expenditure is higher than anticipated, or you haven't hit your volume goals. So reporting compensation and productivity information throughout the year allows you to course correct when necessary or reinforce current successful strategies.
Very helpful. I'll kind of wrap us up here and tee up our next conversation. So I think when I step back from all the I'll call it minutia, but these are really important details that we've covered today as it relates to building, designing, and even thinking about the right kind of compensation plan for your provider network. Ultimately, provider expense is the largest line item on a physician enterprise financial statement, and therefore it becomes a focal point for losses if you are in fact measuring your ROI or your financials as an investment per provider. And yet it's often seen as the area that's the hardest to manage or improve upon or change. And that could be cultural, it could just be limitations that we can't pay less and still recruit talent. And so when we step back and look at the crosswalk of physician compensation or provider compensation and production, I would encourage us, and what we'll do next time is look at the expense as an investment that you offset by revenue growth. And so how do you get the most out of the right plan design? And that's by generating the most revenue that you can with the physician infrastructure, provider infrastructure that you have. And that may be highly reliant upon value-based care revenue, or it might be very tied to fee-for-service. And so we're really focused on work RVUs. But in either scenario, similar to staffing, it's easier to focus on strategies to increase revenue with your provider network than to try to reduce the expense that you see on your financial statements from paying out provider compensation. And so to do that, you got to have the incentive structure in place, and then you have to manage it effectively so that you're not spending extra dollars just to report and or administer your compensation plan. But I think we're going to focus on how you use that compensation plan to drive the right behavior from your provider network, and then what you can do to support those providers as you give them the tools and you've got the incentive structure in place. How do we get more productive? How do we get better? And then how does our incentive structure affect the additional revenue to be generated? So really appreciate everyone joining today. I know Alex spends his days and weeks in this space, and Andy and Baines do as well. And so I appreciate their insights and perspective. This is the complicated area, and often one that our clients are hesitant to touch until they absolutely must, or they can no longer put it aside. I think embracing it, even if it's not the first thing you tackle when you're thinking about performance improvement of a physician enterprise, is to go ahead and acknowledge what a key component this is and use what you have as much as you can to align incentives and to get the most out of your provider network, but also to focus on the things that you can control more easily that aren't as culturally sensitive, and start there. Focus on revenue improvement, and then that kind of buys you the equity that you might need to make some of these more difficult decisions and changing something as personal as provider compensation down the line. So appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you guys for joining, and we look forward to the next session where we'll be talking more directly about how to manage and increase productivity. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.